Hey, good evening. Welcome to Wednesday Night in the Word. Good evening, folks. Got a bigger crowd than last week, so we're stoked about that. And we're glad you're here. Glad you're with us tonight. And we're grateful for an opportunity to get together. While I'm thinking about it, next Wednesday we'll be hosting VBS, Vacation Bible School for our kids, Wednesday through Friday. And they may very well need the sanctuary for some stuff, so we will not be meeting in the house next Wednesday. So next Wednesday will be if you can stand to come help with Bible school, they probably find a work hole to stick you in. And it sounds terrible, I guess, but oh well, it's too late now. But they can probably find a use and serve somehow, so you can do that or stay home and pray for everybody else, I guess. One of those two things. Either way, that'll be how next week we will not be live and we will not be in the house. So just so you know. Anyway, so we're doing part 5 of our Kingdom 101 series. We're still working through the Sermon on the Mount, Constitution of the Kingdom. And we're going to be in a little bit, what I'm going to call some of the more delicate elements of this. Is some of the stuff that people it's a hill some folks are willing to die on. I'll say it to you that way. Because we're going to be dealing with some stuff tonight. I think that the last 2 weeks we've talked about, you've heard it said of old time, but I say unto you. And again, it's that we're looking at the specifics of that, which I believe we are, it's proper to do, but the reality of it is taken in the full context of all this, it is again an exhortation for us to think differently for his generation and therefore generations afterward, to begin to consider things on a different level, not just on a physical or a literal level, but there's some other things. We'll get into some of those things tonight. Hopefully, I won't hurt anybody's feelings too bad. We'll just see what we can do. It's not my ambition or my intent, but there's the kind of subject matter that tends to be a little bit difficult. We're in verse 27. We're going to read verses 27 through 32, but there are two thoughts in there, and it divides after verse 30. So we're going to read 27 through 30, and then we're going to jump over to Matthew 19. Then we're going to come back, time permitting, to finish out verses 30 through 32, or let's see. All right, so let's go. Here we go. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. Says again, this is a common refrain in this section of his message. It is, you have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. Now, that's good advice, okay? It's not just good advice, it's beneficial, healthy, righteous, and proper, okay? That's what that is. Anyway, but he builds on that. He says, because of the legal manner in which everybody was conditioned to think, if you didn't literally do the deed, then you were clear, right? And that's kind of the effect of the law. We talked about some of that a little bit last week. Even in dealing with civil law and criminal law in our culture, the law enforcement at times will tell you, unless they do something, I can't arrest them on intent. Okay, they have to physically do what violates the law, and so that's that legal manner of thinking, which is not wrong. It's just the legal manner and way in which we think. Jesus accelerates that. He kind of I want to say. I wrote this down a little bit today. He wants us to, if I can find it, he wants to, when we change and shift our way of thinking, he wants not just to raise the bar of righteousness for the world, he wants to raise us with the bar, okay? He wants to elevate our thinking and calls us to think higher, think, be preemptive, if you will. Be not just think about things and dwell on them in a negative way and in an improper way, but to control that, to realize that we have to subdue that and pull down every thought, to the obedience of Christ. Paul gets into some of that later. I don't know that we'll get into all that tonight, but anyway, he says, you've heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. Verse 28, but I say unto you that whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. Okay? So he's saying that the desire for what's forbidden needs to be mortified. It needs to be addressed. It needs to be dealt with while it's a thought, rather than to allow it to harbor it, nurse it, rehearse it, or whatever until it manifests itself physically. So he is imploring and instructing his disciples to, when you recognize these weaknesses and these elements of the human condition, you need to find your way to mortify those things, to allow them not to take hold, take root, or otherwise give expression to the thought. And so recognize it in the thought, and it's something between you and God. Okay? You allow it to become a manifestation of physical or literal action, then there's a lot of I'll say reparations, for lack of better terms here. There's a lot of repair work to be done on multiple levels, okay? And so he's actually saying that the thought will be there before the act ever happens. And if you can see the thought, recognize that, and start to pull that down and start to say, okay, we're not doing that, and you start to pull and you start to straighten yourself, he is bringing us into a different level of righteousness and accountability. So the kingdom in many ways it's a spiritual thing, but it is a greater degree of accountability in the presence of God for us than what the law's tough, but the kingdom is saying, hey, just don't get that far. Don't let it get that far. Control yourself. And that's what this is about. You need to have, bringing your body under subjection. There's a lot of ways to do that and a lot of ways that works. But he talks about this, and he says, that if you looked upon a woman with lust, then you have committed adultery with her already in his heart. Now, this is where some folks have said, and I believe errantly, in error, they've said, well, if you think it, you may as well do it. Now, I'm saying to you, I wouldn't necessarily follow that prescription. Okay? That's not the best based logic I've ever heard in my life. So what I'm going to say to you is that if you've been someone who's been affected by that, or somebody you've heard people say that, then that's a red flag. I'm going to say it to you that way. So you need to understand that what is in my heart is between me and my Savior, me and my Father. Well, if I let that get out and I put it out to the world, now I have other things I have that I'm required to do, right? That I need to do to lay it to rest and see relationships fixed, repaired, restored. And in some cases, they can never become what they were before. And so you have to realize that you have an opportunity to make your peace with God without having to let the whole world know, okay? And so that's, to me, that's one of those things that I've heard it said a lot in my lifetime, and sometimes even by religious people, but most of the time it's by people that are not very well schooled in the Word, okay? And so they're going to say, well, if you think that you're guilty of it, you may as well go ahead and do it. I beg to differ, and I beg loudly to differ. So anyway, and so then let's go into verse 29 here. He says, because what I want to do here, we're going to look at some of the most radical things Jesus will say here. And so if you've heard this, and so think about this the mind shift that he's bringing is going to cause us to, pull out of religious thinking, okay? Just strictly religious thinking, okay? And this is, I have been in church services where I've heard people testify. I've heard from pulpits. You know, I've been in different churches and different services for well, I don't want to start counting on my fingers here, but for multiple decades, starting in the 70s, okay? So all I'm going to say is it's been a while, and I've heard this more than once. You'll have people stand up, or you'll have somebody who's speaking stand up and say, they will utter the phrase, I believe that the Bible, that every word in there is literal. And I'm going to tell you, there are things in here that you and I cannot literalize. There are things in here you and I dare not literalize, okay? So, and I've heard that amen very loudly, and I've heard it, and maybe you haven't thought about it in the way that we're going to bring it to you tonight. I doubt that, but anyway, what happened, what we're going to look at here is Jesus employs metaphor and what's called hyperbole. And hyperbole is that exaggeration to make a point, right? We've all done that. It's not just blowing smoke, which what some folks think it might be. But, you know, this is, again, some of the way in which we communicate, forms of language that we use, like, some of it's like like 1,000 years is as a day, and a day as 1,000 years. We pull out a calculator and we say, okay, a day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. That's not really what it says. It says it's as. What he's really saying is that we can't measure time the same way God does. Okay? And it's not necessarily an equation for equivalence. Okay? And so what I'm getting at here is that, so he says, he's talked about looking on people, looking on a woman with lust, and that there's guilt in that, and let me say this about guilt and shame. Guilt and shame is a corrective mechanism that is God-given to the world. Now, what we've done with it is we have weaponized it to control people and to manipulate people. And when we've done that, we have used it as a club or a cudgel, and we beat people with it, and we have made it this thing we recoil from. But if you and I make a decision that doesn't turn out so well, and we feel guilty about it, that's a mechanism that says, hey, maybe you want to think it through a little better next time, right? Maybe you want to give it a little bit more forethought and before you act, and so it's in its base form, it's designed to help advance us ultimately. But when we take it and we start to try to make people feel guilty so that we can manipulate and control them, and that's oftentimes how it's used, then it becomes this destructive force, okay? And it puts people into a bondage, and puts a yoke and a weight upon them that they cannot seem to shake or get rid of, because we're always finding a way to continue to make them feel guilty. And so what we have to do is we need to understand the basic of it and how it's designed to work and what it's designed to do, and then we need to be able to allow it to be what it is and try not to make more out of it. Okay? So why did I just say all that? It's a good question. Excuse me, but if you have an improper thought and you get checked by that in a sense of guilt, or I shouldn't have thought like that. See, that's a corrective mechanism. So now you have to refocus, you have to retool, you have to ask the Lord to bring you higher to work in your life, right? That's what it's designed to do. But when it's used, like I say, as a tool and weapon of manipulation to control people or make everybody live the way I think they should live, then it's a different animal altogether. So anyhow, He says, and if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. So, is Jesus telling you that if you see something and you can't, that you need to take a spoon and scoop an eyeball out? Literally? I don't think so. This is hyperbole. This is saying you need to make an effort to control and balance what you see, so that you don't think of it and see it in a way that is improper, or in a way that is unhealthy, or in a way that's a way that you shouldn't look at it in a particular fashion. Okay, so he's bringing us into a different dimension of life. And he's saying, these thoughts are going to show up, and but you're going to have to exercise some self-discipline and some self-control. You're going to have to take responsibility for your thinking, for what you see, and how you move forward, and how you look at things, right? I mean, this is, like I say, it's very basic stuff, but it's stuff that we rarely hear anybody talk about in this vein, okay? But he's not telling you to go, stick your thumb in your eye and, or take a spoon and dig it out of there, or this is not literal. This is why I say that we get caught up in the literality of the word, and for the most part, that's a pretty safe thing to do. But there are those exceptions. There's not a literal well that springs up out of your belly, right? It's the spiritual thing. It's a living thing that moves in you. It's not actual, real, literal water that flows up out of you, but it refreshes you like water. But it moves through you like in a glorious fashion to refresh, renew, and reconstitute you. Okay? So there are elements of this and things about the word that we have to be wise in how we interpret it. That's why Paul talked to Timothy about rightly dividing the word of truth. So we have to be able to discern and divide the word in a way that is in a way that's consistent with Christ, with his teaching, with his kingdom, and with what he sat down as the authoritative constitution of the kingdom in our lives. So if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that your whole body should be cast into hell. Verse 30, and if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. So, the pulling together of this one thought all starts with being able, with the reality of saying, hey, you're going to be guilty of something if you don't control your thoughts, if you don't bring that down, if you can't control the way you think, you're going to have to control something else. And he's not telling you to cut your hand off or cut your foot off literally, but he's saying you have to restrain what you reach for. If you're having an improper thought and you have it when you look, then don't look. If you have an improper thought or an improper impulse to reach your hand out, don't reach your hand out. Plenty of times you just like to reach your hand out and grab somebody by the shirt collar and give them a good shaking, right? But what do? Figuratively speaking, you cut your hand off. You don't reach out and do it, as much as you might be tempted inwardly to do that. You don't do it, and so that's part of that subduing and the crucifixion of the disciple as he follows Christ. Right? Last week we talked about take up your cross and follow me. Right? It's that willingness to let this die so that you can live a better life. And so there's a certain amount of this that fits here. And so one of the things that he gets to here is when he starts talking about this is not an easy thing to have a discourse on, because everybody has a difference of opinion about stuff like this. And so it's, He talks about, so adultery is more than just the physical act. Unchecked, it's something that can go on. This is why I think I can say this. So forgive me if I'm pushing it too far for everybody tonight. But this is why porn is so unhealthy. Because it sets your mind in a place where you have these thoughts and they run rampant to every kind of extreme you can think of, okay? And so that's why that we live in a world where this stuff is so easily accessible. It's one of the reasons why that we have some of the issues that we've got going on in the world, okay? So think about what he's saying here, and then think about how our culture's structured and the things that we're doing that simply engage and entertain the mind. All right? And so there's some of that stuff that needs to be pulled down. It needs to be brought down. It needs to be brought into subjection to the will and purpose of God, into harmony with the heart of God and the kingdom of God. And so it becomes this I'll say struggle for lack of better terms, but I want you to understand that we have grace to do this. That God has given us the grace to be able to be victorious over these kind of things. So it's not something that we can attribute some of that to human nature, and I'm okay with that to a point. It's when we brush it aside and say it's human nature and you can't do anything about it. Because we're not just human nature. We've been born again. There's a divine nature now that has been birthed in you and I. There's an identity that is connected directly to the fatherhood of God, and now we are challenged to think better. Now we are challenged to move upward and onward. We're challenged to rise above the carnal and the mundane. Okay? And this to me is what he's doing. And in order to do that, you check that. You start to pull that down. You start to break free from those kind of thoughts and that kind of restriction. And now you start to come into an expression of life and grace that's very, very strong, very practical, we'll say. And it's because you can't, some folks say, well, you can't help what you think. And there's a certain amount of truth to that until you start to discipline your mind. Then you can. You may not do it all the time, but you figured out how to do it. So now you figure out it might catch you off guard once in a while, but you bring it in. You bring it under subjection, and you get your ship righted, we'll say, and you get your self recalibrated and get yourself redirected. And when you're dealing with the kind of culture, and not just Jewish culture, they had, Exodus 20 and 14 was, one of the top 10 commands of God was thou shalt not commit adultery, right? So it's not like he was telling them something new. He said, this goes back for you and I. This goes back in their culture a long way. But I'm telling you, before the deed, there's the thought. And if you can recognize the thought and pull it down, then the deed will not take place. That's kingdom victory. That's kingdom living. That's seeing things. That's recognition and preemptive motivation and moving into the kind of life and the kind of grace and the kind of manner of life and abundant life that he has designed for us. Praise the Lord. So anyway, that gets a little in this in our culture. That talking about stuff like this kind of gets a little bit tight for folks, and so. Anyway, but don't forget to recognize metaphor, allegory, and hyperbole. See, those are some of the things that I think that I have a book of idioms and colloquialisms and things like that from Aramaic that this Aramaic scholar did that I brought in with me in case I use it. And I don't know that I'm going to. Jackie, I don't know that I'm going to go to Matthew 19 tonight. I don't know that I'm going to need to do that. So I feel like I've got this, because Matthew 19 is where he gets questioned. So yeah, let's do it. Let's go to Matthew 19. See there? She talked me into it. Lord, the woman thou gavest me. Actually, she's doing good. She gives me enough rope, but I hang myself. So, Matthew 19. This one, again, these scriptures are I'm going to start with, what's my first one? Is it 3? So in light of what he teaches at the outset about how to combat and how to navigate, how to not fall into this kind of a pit, okay? Recognize the thought, the potential, and steer yourself away from it, if I can say it to you that way. And you say, well, people ought to know to do that. Well, yeah, they ought to have. But, the world's full of believers, and dare I say preachers, that didn't pay enough attention to this to stay on track and to keep themselves in the vein of what God's purpose for their life was. They get derailed and tore up and shipwrecked, and to be blunt, I get tired of the collateral damage. I get a little frustrated with all the folks that fall out over this kind of stuff, because we're not our own. No man lives unto himself, Paul said, neither do we die unto ourselves. Whether we live or whether we die, he said, we're the Lord's. But think about that for a minute. And so that the things that I do, the decisions I make, and the things that I do are going to have ramifications for everybody connected with me to some degree. Now, I can't live my life in the overwhelming trying to figure out what everybody thinks I ought to do. But if I live by the principle of the kingdom, then I'm going to be okay. More often than not, I'm going to be okay. And but what I'm after is you think, you'd like to just say, well, we don't need to talk about this. But you look at where people are, what we've got going on culturally, what we know to be true in our, not just in human history, but in recent history. And when I say recent, I mean in the last 20, 30 years. We can't just not talk about this. I mean, I don't see any way that it does anybody any good to ignore it. All right? So, all right. So let's, Matthew chapter 19, I'm going to start with verse 3. So the Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? So here's the question. So they've heard some of this stuff. They've heard what he said. And so, again, there's this dishonesty in the framing of the question, because they're really not wanting an answer. They're just trying to trip him. They're just trying to trick him. They're just trying to get him to say something that they can accuse him in, okay? If it were a genuine, honest question, then he could have a real honest conversation and give them a genuine answer. But because it's got all the religious trappings around it, so you have to navigate some of this stuff. And so the Pharisees, they come to him, tempting him, testing him, poking around to find a soft spot or a sore spot, okay? It's like going to the doctor and they start punching around on you and say, does that hurt? Well, it depends on how hard you punch me, right? Some things is tender, and you can diagnose a few things, or at least discover sensitive areas that way. I get that. But what they were doing was they were trying to find a place to accuse, trying to find a place to be able to exploit him or exploit the people and keep them away from him and discredit him. So this is not that's why I say it's dishonest. It's not a real question in search of a real answer. It's trickery. It's religious gamesmanship, we'll say. Okay? And so they come to him and they say, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? In other words, for whatever reason. Don't like her cooking. Give her the heave-ho. Interested in somebody else. Give her the heave-ho, right? Just, so I'm not trying to be crude here. I'm just trying to their question is for every cause, right? And he says, and he answered and said unto them, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? So what does Jesus do? He takes them to the baseline. He takes them to the foundation. And by the way, male and female is the deal. Just so you know. There's a lot of confusion about that. I'm just saying, male and female is pretty much sums it up perfectly, okay? And he said, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? Verse 5, and said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Verse 6, wherefore they are no more twain or two, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. They say unto him, so Jesus basically says that God made male and female, he made man and woman, and he brought them together, and so that they would have an anchor point, a cornerstone relationship to build a family, build a life. Okay? So, male and female, and Jesus said, and they will cleave to one another. They leave father and mother, and they cleave to one another. That's what they do. So, and he says, what God's joined together, let not man put asunder. So Jesus takes them back, and he says, this is the ideal. Okay? This is how God ordained it, intended it, and set it forth. And so then verse 7 says, so before I do that, I need to look at something real quick here, because I wrote it down the other day. I was listening to some guys talking about something, and I wanted to make sure I get this right, so I wrote it down. So in Genesis, when God created Eve, and he said, when he says, not good that man be alone, I will make a helpmeet for him. We look at that, and that's been a topic of great, probably discussion and perhaps even argument. And we look at that and we think, well, then she's subordinate and help me. She's just there to help. But God takes her from his side. He doesn't take her from his feet so that he can walk on her, or he doesn't take her from his head so she can rule over him, but he brings her out of his heart, out of his breath, out of the center of all that he is. The word helpmeet in Hebrew, for us, what we do is we look at it and we think it's become this idea of a helper or a servant, and it actually is in Hebrew. It means someone who is equal to him. All right? Now, see, that's a pretty cool deal, right? In fact, literally, I heard another guy talk about it. He refers to Eve as beneficial adversary. Okay? And I'm thinking, you think, well, adversary, they should be partners. True. Adam's named everything in the world. He's named all the animals. He's looked at everything and called it what it was. The only thing Adam couldn't look at was Adam. What he needed was somebody on par with him to be able to say and speak into his life, to be able to communicate with him, to be able to balance and to integrate himself and to build something together. So there's an equality that was from the outset and from the beginning that has been too long overlooked. It's been, let me say it this way, it's been lost in the translation because we've made it, we have imagined it to be something less than what God says it is. And so when you talk about, when he goes back to the beginning, male and female created he them, he created both male and female in the image and likeness of God. So that gives everyone intrinsic value. It gives male and female both the quality of value and preciousness that needs to be upheld and needs to be honored and needs to be esteemed one to the other. That's the design of it. And so that's it's a power, not just a powerful idea, it is, but it is to me it is how God set the world and set humanity to be built out of that idea. And somewhere along the line, we've made it something other than it was, and now we've got all kinds of kooky ideas about it. Anyway, better move on. But I couldn't not touch on that tonight with Jesus reaching back to the beginning and saying that here. And he says, so verse 7 is where we are. They say unto him, why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement to put her away? So Jesus' answer to them was that God gave us marriage. Jesus didn't talk about divorce at all. And so that's what they were after, right? They're after something. So they said, okay, then, so are you saying Moses was wrong to do this? See the religious gamesmanship here? So are you saying that Moses was wrong to give us a writing of divorcement and to put her away? And verse 8 says, he saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. So, the idea of of how relationships are built, they're after carte blanche in how to trade wives like you trade cars. Okay? And that's kind of what, in a modern metaphor, that's probably how we would do that. But he's not, Jesus is not having that. He said, Moses, it takes a hardness of the heart. Man, if something's good, if a fundamental relationship is going to break and going to be deconstructed, then it's going to take some toughness to do that. And he's not advocating that, but by the same token, he's not throwing people away who have. Okay? And this is one of the things that we, that we run into. You can get so hard with, that's why I said this is so uncomfortable for so many people. Because there's not very many families, not very many individuals that have not had this experience or not had someone they love and care for try to find their way forward from an experience like this. So it's it's definitely not an end to salvation by any stretch of the imagination. So, but he goes on to say, and I say unto you, verse 9, see, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, for unfaithfulness, and shall marry another, commits adultery. And so if you just trade her in because you don't like her cooking, or those kind of things, if they've broken the fidelity vow, then that's a real thing, Jesus says. Okay? And then he says, and whosoever and shall marry another commits adultery, and whosoever marries her which is put away doth commit adultery. But in the Aramaic, because I'm going to get into something here. That's a friend of mine that you're going to get to meet here, does written a whole book on, he called it myths and mistranslations and something else. But I don't know that he talks about any of this, but this actually in the Aramaic form of Matthew, this says, this is how it reads, because it uses the Aramaic word shvikta, and it says, this is how it's worded here. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except to be for fornication, and shall marry another, commits adultery. And whosoever marrieth her, which is shvikta, which means undivorced, does commit adultery. So it reads a little differently in King James. What I'm after here is what he was dealing with was husbands who would turn their wives out and not give them a writing of divorcement. And so what he was saying is if you marry someone in that state, then you put yourself in an adulterous relationship. So if people who are divorced are free to remarry, this is what I'm getting at here, okay? And you're free to pursue that if you've been through that, then you've got that, you have the ability to do that. You're free to do that, and you're free to be part of what's going on, right? So, you all right? Okay, all right, good deal. Okay, so I wanted to point that out because it looks like, it's different denominations put such emphasis on this that it gets really squirrely and it gets really difficult. And I think that if you look at it from this vantage point, it really kind of settles some things out that you can find a way forward in that through that mess, because people's lives get messy. Okay, so now let's go back to Matthew chapter 5. Since he was talking about adultery, I wanted to get into that and try to lay that to rest. I hope that was helpful. I hope it so we're at verse 31, I think. Keep me straight there, Jackie. So he gets into another, it hath been said. Okay. Whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. Okay? So the reason I wanted to read that other one was because if you bring those two things into context, then you have a way forward for what appears to be an insurmountable obstacle for a lot of people. Because if you go some places, they're going to tell you that you know, if you've been kind of through the mill with some of this stuff, you don't have a whole lot of hope, right? And I don't believe that's what Jesus is trying to position. I don't think he's trying to put us in this sense of hopelessness. I think what he's saying is that there's protocol and there's propriety, and if the legal ramifications of it have been met, and you move forward this direction, then you can still be part of the kingdom. You can still be you're good. You can work your way forward. Okay, and you've got to know that there is hope beyond the mess. Because I'll tell you what, I've been through this with people who have just been so devastated by it that they can't seem to find their way forward. And it's hard, it's slow going. But once you find your way forward, then the last thing you need somebody to stand up here and tell you that what you've done is unforgivable and you can't get past it and you can't get beyond it. Because I don't believe that for a minute. And I don't believe that's what Jesus was saying in any of this. I believe he was dealing with a religious attitude and a religious mindset that was trying to make everything play everything to their advantage and tilt the playing field. And Jesus was simply leveling the field and saying, hey, then you need to do this thing, do it right, and so that everybody can move forward and everybody can have a life moving forward. And that's really, in my estimation, that's what he was saying. And that's because the kingdom's about you finding him. And what did it take? You know, I mean, think about the woman at the well. You know, I mean, if you want to get into some of the stuff where people have preached so very hard against divorce and all that kind of stuff, then he should have just avoided her altogether. He should have just simply said, you know, you got no chance, sissy, you got no chance. But he didn't. He brought her the Word of God. He brought her the life of God, and he opened the kingdom to her. And so you hear this, and you hear people talk about it, and you hear them fight their way, kind of paint themselves in a corner with it. And I think it's worth mentioning, it's worth dealing with and addressing, because life gets crazy and things don't always work out in an ideal sense, but God's still God. and God still saves, and God still redeems, and God still gives love and life and blessing and favor and all that stuff. So all of this again has to do with you have to shift the way you think a little bit, and some of that is so because we can get so very narrow in that we don't have a way forward. We kind of move into this we get in such a narrow channel that we get stuck in it. And I don't believe Jesus was ever trying to get us to get stuck in something. I think he wants us to come into the kingdom, and he wants us to live well and to step forward and to be all that he has called us to be. And so you start from this day, you start from where you are, and as you meet him and walk with him and grow in him, there's this marvelous scripture so to be fair, he's talking to a bunch of folks who probably have more than one wife anyway, okay, in the Jewish culture that he's talking to. Now, not every Jewish man did that, but there were several who did. And, it was Christianity that brought monogamy to the world. The Greeks sure didn't do it. The Romans didn't do it. Judaism, Islam doesn't do it. And I'm not casting stones, folks. I'm simply just laying this out. It was the Apostle Paul and the example of Christ in the church then becomes the primary example. And it becomes that ideal, if you will, that a husband and wife, that's the target, that's the bullseye that we shoot toward, that we point ourselves toward, and we evaluate ourselves in light of that, and we try to and we move toward that as best we can. Sometimes it's very slow going. Sometimes some days better than others. I get it, but when he says to be the husband of one wife, people get into that and think, okay, I've been married more than once, I'm not qualified. It literally means a one-woman man. So if you are a one-woman man, and I believe that if that's true, then it needs to be true on the other side as well, a one-man woman, okay? Then you have the capacity to live and have a relationship that is moving toward the ideal of Christ and his church, and that gives us that's what culturally sets us in this place of monogamy and of a singular relationship and having value to it when it's not about property. It's not about having a harem. It's about having a partner. It's about having a relationship. It's about having a beneficial adversary, right? Somebody who can stand shoulder to shoulder and walk with equality and with the same, not behind 5 steps but beside, arm in arm and move forward. It's a powerful thing, and that doesn't always get conveyed very well, even in modern marriage ceremonies and things of that nature. We're still. I tell folks if they come to me to do a wedding, I said, look, your marriage is a partnership. It's not a pecking order. It's not for him to rule over you. It's for you to learn to submit yourself one to another. It's for you to learn how to work together. You are yoked together. That's why Paul said to not be unequally yoked. Right? It's not because what is it in the law? It says you're not supposed to yoke an ox and an ass together, because a donkey will sit down in a harness. A mule will sit down in the harness, but an ox will plow his heart out. And he'll just keep going, right? So if you have two that are unlike, that are not alike, then you're going to have a problem getting things done efficiently. And so that's That's a very powerful. I believe that's an allusion to that when Paul says, but talks about not being unequally yoked. I believe it's a reference to this is what the law intended when Moses laid that principle out, because he talks about not muzzling the ox that treads the corn. And then he asked the question, does God take care for oxen? Does God really care about the ox getting fed? Well, sort of. Or did he write it for our sakes? And he goes on to say, for our sakes, no doubt it is written, that he that laboreth should be able to eat the fruit of his labor. And so he talks about if you labor in the gospel, you should be partaker of the gospel and all those kind of things. So he takes those literal things in the law and he brings them into a new and fresh way to look at them in light of the kingdom and in light of thinking in the realm of the kingdom. And so we're looking at what it means to have a functional, viable, the kind of relationship that is, not necessarily on display for all the world to honor, but by the same token, it's designed to be a light. It's designed to be, it's designed to show the light, show the way forward for our children and for our grandchildren and for communities. It's designed to be that. And so that's why Jesus is not, he's not endorsing divorce in this text, nor is he throwing divorcees away. And that's important to know, because when you talk about it, him not endorsing this or it being his, not having his seal of approval, so to speak, but you and I have it. And so this is, it's still him loving people and taking us as imperfectly as we may be. He still receives us and does a perfect work in our life. So I don't know that I got that said like I needed to tonight, but I fumbled around there till I got close. Anyway, that's really all I got tonight. But those are because I knew that was going to be. I didn't want to cover a lot of ground, but those are kind of sticky. Those are things they're kind of like burrs in the woods. They'll stick to you, and you've got to pick them off a little bit here and there. But Jesus thought it important enough to address it, to bring us, how do we move on in the kingdom with that? You do it by thinking like he thinks and beginning to understand that we have there's a protocol, a priority, and a reality that God's grace is sufficient for us on each side of the issue. And so there we need to rest. There we need to rest in him, his mercy, his love, and his goodness. Amen. I think I better quit there before I keep digging and getting clear over my head. Hey, bless you. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you got something out of there.